there is a question that most people who have read the Bible never think to ask. When the prophets of Israel condemned the worship of Baal and Asherah and Molech and Dagon and Chemosh and a dozen other gods, were they saying these gods did not exist? Were they saying the people who worshipped them were simply confused, bowing down to pieces of wood and stone that had no reality behind them? Or were they saying something more disturbing, something that requires a different kind of attention? Here is what most people never realize about the false gods of the Bible. The biblical writers do not primarily argue that the gods of the nations do not exist. They argue that the gods of the nations are not Yahweh, that they are not the Creator, that they are not sovereign, that they are not worthy of worship, but they are remarkably frank about the reality of what is behind the idols. 1 Corinthians 10 verse 20. Paul, writing to the Corinthians about food offered to idols, he does not say the idol is nothing, so eating food offered to it is meaningless. He says what pagans sacrifice they offer to demons and not to God. I do not want you to be participants with demons, real beings, behind the idols, receiving the worship that the idols attract. The idol itself is nothing. Isaiah 44 describes with devastating irony a man who cuts down a tree, uses half of it for firewood to warm himself and cook his food, and makes the other half into a god to bow down to. The idol is wood. The idol is nothing. But Paul says something is receiving the worship. Something is behind the nothing, and that something is demonic. Deuteronomy 32 verse 17. They sacrificed to demons that were no gods, gods they had not known, new gods that had come recently whom your fathers had never dreaded, demons that were no gods. Both things are true simultaneously in the biblical framework. The gods of the nations are not gods in the sense that Yahweh is God. They are not creators. They are not sovereign over history. They are not worthy of worship, and they are demons, real spiritual entities, receiving misdirected worship, exercising real spiritual influence, causing real damage to the people and communities who fall under their sway. This is the framework the Bible operates in when it talks about false gods, not the framework of modern atheism that says all supernatural beings are fictional, not the framework of religious pluralism that says all gods are equally valid paths to the same divine reality. The framework of spiritual warfare, of real beings competing for the worship that belongs to one God alone, and of that one God systematically, comprehensively, and finally defeating every one of them. Stay with me, because by the end of this video you will have met every major false god in the Bible. You will understand what each one represented, what spiritual reality was behind each idol, and how Yahweh defeated each one. And you will see the Bible's engagement with the false gods of the nations not as an embarrassing relic of ancient superstition, but as a record of the most significant spiritual conflict in the history of the world. Before we go through the false gods, we need to establish the biblical theology of what is actually happening when a nation worships an idol. The Hebrew Bible uses several words for the gods of the nations. Elohim, the same word used for God himself, but used in a broader sense to describe supernatural beings. Elilim, worthless things, nothings. Shikutzim, detestable things. And Shedim, demons, the word used in Deuteronomy 32. Here is what most people never realize about the Hebrew word Elohim. It is a plural noun used for the one God of Israel throughout the Old Testament, and it is also used for the divine council, the supernatural beings who serve in the heavenly court. Psalm 82 verse 1. God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, Elohim, he holds judgment. Psalm 82 is one of the most revealing passages in the entire Old Testament about the biblical understanding of spiritual powers. God presides over a council of supernatural beings. He judges them for their failure. They have judged unjustly and shown partiality to the wicked. Verse 5, they have neither knowledge nor understanding. They walk about in darkness. And verse 6 and 7, I said you are gods, sons of the Most High, all of you. Nevertheless, like men you shall die and fall like any prince, gods who will die. Supernatural beings who were given authority over the nations and abused it, who led the nations into injustice and idolatry, and who will be judged for it. Deuteronomy 32 verse 8 and 9. When the Most High gave to the nations their inheritance, when he divided mankind, he fixed the borders of the peoples according to the number of the sons of God. But the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob his allotted heritage. The nations were assigned to supernatural beings, sons of God, at the division of the peoples. These beings were meant to govern the nations justly and point them toward the Most High. Instead, they accepted the worship that belonged to God alone and became the false gods of the nations. The demons behind the idols, the spiritual powers behind Baal and Asherah and Dagon and Chemosh and every other deity in the ancient world, this is the battlefield. This is what the Bible's engagement with false gods is actually about. Not primitive people confused about whether pieces of wood are alive. Supernatural beings who rebelled against the sovereignty of the Creator and accepted worship from the nations they were supposed to shepherd, and one God who is systematically taking back what belongs to him. Now let us meet the false gods one by one. The first and most pervasive false god in the Bible is Baal. The name Baal simply means Lord or Master or Owner. It is not a proper name in the way that Yahweh is a proper name. It is a title, a description of what the god claimed to be, the Lord of the land, the Master of the storm, the owner of the rain and the fertility and the agricultural abundance that made life possible in the ancient Near East. Baal worship was the dominant religion of Canaan. When Israel entered the Promised Land, they were entering a world saturated with Baal worship. Every high place, every hilltop, every local shrine was dedicated to Baal or one of his regional expressions: Baal Peor, Baal Berith, Beelzebul. The same spiritual entity operating under different local names in different locations. Here is what most people never realize about why Baal worship was so appealing to Israel. It was practical, immediately practical. You wanted rain? You worshipped Baal, the storm god who controlled the rain. You wanted a good harvest? You worshipped Baal, the fertility god who gave increase to crops and flocks. You wanted your children to survive infancy in a world with catastrophic infant mortality. You worshipped Baal and Asherah, whose worship included rituals designed to secure fertility and life. Yahweh made demands. He required exclusive loyalty. He demanded justice and holiness and covenant faithfulness. He was invisible and could not be represented by an image. He was not tied to a specific territory or a specific function. He was not one god among many who could be added to a religious portfolio alongside the local deities. Baal was easy. Baal was local. Baal was immediately relevant to the practical concerns of agricultural life, and Baal did not demand that you give up the other gods. The temptation to add Baal to the worship of Yahweh, to maintain both, to cover all the spiritual bases, is the temptation that the Book of Judges traces through 7 cycles, and the books of Kings trace through 40 kings, and the prophets spend centuries confronting. And the definitive confrontation comes on Mount Carmel. 1 Kings 18, Elijah against 450 prophets of Baal, 2 altars, 2 gods, 1 real, 1 not. The challenge is simple. The God who answers by fire, he is God. The prophets of Baal call on their God from morning until noon. They leap around the altar, they cut themselves with swords and spears until blood gushes out. Elijah mocks them. Perhaps your God is sleeping. Perhaps he's relieving himself. Call louder. No fire comes. Elijah repairs the altar of Yahweh, digs a trench around it, has it soaked with water 3 times, and prays one simple prayer. Yahweh, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known today that you are God in Israel and that I am your servant and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, Yahweh, answer me, so that this people may know that you, Yahweh, are God and that you have turned their hearts back. Fire falls, consumes the burnt offering and the wood and the stones and the dust and licks up the water in the trench. And the people fall on their faces and say, Yahweh, he is God. Yahweh, he is God. Baal is silent. Yahweh speaks in fire. The defeat of Baal on Mount Carmel is the most dramatic single confrontation between Yahweh and a false god in the entire Old Testament. And its meaning is unambiguous. The God that Israel kept choosing over Yahweh could not answer, could not send fire, could not produce the one thing that would have validated his claim to be Lord, because he is not Lord. Yahweh is Lord. Asherah is the second major Canaanite deity, and she is almost always paired with Baal in the biblical text. Asherah was the mother goddess of the Canaanite pantheon. In the ancient mythological texts discovered at Ugarit in Syria in the 1930s, she is described as the consort of El, the chief god and the mother of 70 gods. She was associated with the sea, with fertility, with motherhood, with trees. Her symbol was a wooden pole or a living tree, the Asherah pole that appears throughout the Old Testament as a marker of idolatrous worship. 1 Kings 14, verse 23. They also built for themselves high places and pillars and asherim on every high hill and under every green tree, on every high hill and under every green tree. The Asherah poles were everywhere. In the temple itself during the reigns of wicked kings, the most sacred space in Israel, the dwelling place of Yahweh, was desecrated by the symbol of the goddess who was supposed to be Baal's consort. Here is what most people never realize about Asherah in the archaeological record. Inscriptions discovered at Untitled Chapter in the Sinai desert, dating to approximately the 8th century BC, contain the phrase Yahweh and his Asherah. Some Israelites during this period were apparently worshipping Yahweh with an Asherah consort, giving the God of Israel a goddess companion, syncretizing the exclusive monotheism of the covenant with the fertility religion of Canaan. This is exactly what the prophets were confronting, not the worship of other gods instead of Yahweh. The worship of other gods alongside Yahweh, the reduction of the sovereign creator of the universe to one deity among many in a religious marketplace. King Josiah's reform in 2 Kings 23 is the most comprehensive destruction of Asherah worship recorded in the Bible. He broke down the houses of the male cult prostitutes that were in the house of the Lord where the women wove hangings for the Asherah. 2 Kings 23 verse 7. He removed the Asherah pole from the temple itself and burned it at the Kidron Valley. The Asherah was in the temple of Yahweh. The goddess whose worship was the most explicit violation of the first commandment was housed in the building that bore the name of the one who gave the first commandment. Josiah burns it. The reform is real, but it does not last. His successors return to the old patterns, and the Babylonians come. Molech is the most disturbing of all the false gods in the Bible, and the most unambiguous in terms of what its worship required. The name Molech, the Hebrew melech with a vowel change to signal contempt, means king. Molech was the god of the Ammonites, the nation descended from Lot's younger daughter, on the eastern side of the Jordan, and Molech's worship required the sacrifice of children. Leviticus 18 verse 21. You shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord, you shall not give any of your children. The command is specific because the practice was real. Israelite parents were offering their children to Molech. In the Valley of Hinnom, the Gehinnom that becomes Gehenna in the New Testament, a place called Topheth, children were sacrificed by fire. 2 Kings 23 verse 10. He defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, that no one might burn his son or his daughter as an offering to Molech. Jeremiah 7 verse 31. They have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command, and it did not come into my mind. Which I did not command, and it did not come into my mind. God's response to child sacrifice is not just prohibition, it is horror. The idea that he would require the sacrifice of children is described as something that never entered his mind. The contrast between the God who provides a substitute sacrifice in Genesis 22, who stops Abraham from killing Isaac and provides a ram, and Molech who demands the actual sacrifice of children, could not be more stark. Here is what most people never realize about Molech worship in Israel. It was not practiced by pagans who had never heard of Yahweh. It was practiced by Israelites, by people who knew the law, who had heard the prohibition. King Solomon built a high place for Molech on the hill east of Jerusalem. 1 Kings 11 verse 7. The wisest man who ever lived built a shrine for the god whose worship required burning children. And King Manasseh, 2 Kings 21 verse 6. He burned his son as an offering and used fortune-telling and omens, and dealt with mediums and with necromancers. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. He burned his son. The king of Israel, the son of David, ruling from the city that bore the name of God, burned his own son as an offering to Molech. The defeat of Molech is not a single dramatic confrontation like Elijah on Mount Carmel. It is the slow, painful, costly process of the prophets and the reforming kings dismantling a practice so deeply embedded in the surrounding culture that even the most prominent members of the covenant community fell into it. And it is finally accomplished not by human reform but by the destruction of Jerusalem and the exile to Babylon. God removes his people from the land rather than allow the land to continue bearing the weight of child sacrifice. Dagon is the god of the Philistines, and his confrontation with Yahweh is one of the most darkly comic scenes in the entire Old Testament. Dagon was an ancient Semitic deity associated with grain and agriculture, possibly also with fish based on his name's resemblance to the Hebrew dag, meaning fish. He was worshipped throughout the ancient Near East, but his most prominent temples in the biblical narrative are in the Philistine cities of Gaza and Ashdod. The confrontation between Dagon and Yahweh happens when the Philistines capture the Ark of the Covenant and bring it to Ashdod. 1 Samuel 5, they set the Ark of God next to Dagon, And when the people of Ashdod rose early the next day, there was Dagon fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord, fallen face downward before the ark, in his own temple, in the most sacred space of his own worship. Dagon is face down before the presence of Yahweh. They set him up again. The next morning Dagon was fallen face downward on the ground before the ark of the Lord and the head of Dagon, and both his hands were lying cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him, the head and the hands, the seat of intelligence and the instruments of action, severed, lying on the threshold of his own temple. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. The god of the Philistines has been dismembered in his own house by the presence of Yahweh. Here is what most people never realize about the Dagon narrative. The Philistines respond not by abandoning Dagon worship, but by refusing to step on the threshold where his head and hands fell. 1 Samuel 5 verse 5. That is why the priests of Dagon and all who enter the house of Dagon do not step on the threshold of Dagon in Ashdod to this day. They built a religious tradition around the evidence of their god's defeat. The threshold that no one steps on is the place where Dagon's severed head and hands landed. They preserve the memory of his humiliation as a religious ritual, which is either the most ironic or the most human response to cognitive dissonance in the entire ancient world. Dagon reappears once more in the Bible, Judges 16. Samson has been captured by the Philistines. His eyes have been gouged out. He is grinding grain in the prison at Gaza, and the Philistines gather in the temple of Dagon to celebrate and sacrifice to their god, saying, "Our God has given Samson our enemy into our hand. Our God has given Samson into our hand," crediting Dagon with the capture of the man whose strength came from Yahweh. Samson prays, one last time, "Yahweh, God, please remember me and please strengthen me only this once, O God, that I may be avenged on the Philistines for my 2 eyes." He pushes the pillars. The temple collapses. The dead whom he killed at his death were more than those he had killed during his life. Judges 16, verse 30. In the house of Dagon, under the roof of the god who claimed credit for Samson's capture, the final act of the man whose strength came from Yahweh destroys the building dedicated to Dagon and kills more Philistines than he killed in his entire life. Dagon claimed the victory. Yahweh had the last word. Chemosh is the national god of Moab. The nation descended from Lot's older daughter on the eastern side of the Dead Sea. Numbers 21, verse 29 describes the Moabites as the people of Chemosh. The national identity of Moab was inseparable from the worship of Chemosh. He was their patron deity, their national champion, the god they credited with their victories and blamed for their defeats. Chemosh was a war god, a god of conquest and territorial control. His worship likely included human sacrifice. The Moabite stone, an archaeological inscription discovered in 1868, describes King Mesha of Moab sacrificing his firstborn son on the city wall when the battle was going against him. 2 Kings 3, verse 27. Here is what most people never realize about Chemosh in the biblical narrative. King Solomon built a high place for Chemosh on the hill east of Jerusalem, 1 Kings 11, verse 7. The same chapter that records Solomon building a high place for Molech, the wisest and most blessed king in Israel's history, building shrines for the gods of his foreign wives on the hill overlooking the city of God, and Jeremiah 48 delivers the most comprehensive judgment against Chemosh in the entire Bible. Verse 7. Because you trusted in your works and your treasures, you also shall be taken. And Chemosh shall go into exile with his priests and his officials together. Chemosh shall go into exile. The god of Moab will be carried away with his people, not victorious, not defending his nation, exiled. A captive god carried into Babylon alongside the people who trusted him. The god who was worshipped as the lord of the territory will lose the territory. The god who was credited with military victory will be present for military defeat. The national champion of Moab will be led away in chains with the nation he failed to protect. Ashtoreth, also known as Astarte, is the Canaanite goddess of love, war, and fertility. The Semitic version of the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar, the queen of heaven that Jeremiah's audience was burning incense to in the streets of Jerusalem. 1 Kings 11, verse 5. Solomon went after Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians. Jeremiah 7, verse 18. The children gather wood, the fathers kindle fire, and the women knead dough to make cakes for the queen of heaven. The queen of heaven. Ashtoreth worship involved the entire family in a domestic religious practice. Children gathering wood, fathers building fires, women baking cakes shaped like the goddess, a family activity, a household religion. the worship of the Queen of Heaven woven into the daily domestic life of Jerusalem. And Jeremiah 44 records the most extraordinary response to prophetic warning in the entire Old Testament. After the fall of Jerusalem, Jewish refugees in Egypt are still burning incense to the Queen of Heaven. Jeremiah warns them. And the women respond in verse 16 and 17. As for the word that you have spoken to us in the name of the Lord, we will not listen to you. But we will do everything that we have vowed. Make offerings to the Queen of Heaven, and pour out drink offerings to her, as we did, both we and our fathers, our kings and our officials, in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem. For then we had plenty of food and prospered and saw no disaster. We will not listen to you. We will keep worshipping the Queen of Heaven. Because when we worshipped her, we had plenty of food. The theological argument is economic. Ashtoreth worship was associated in their experience with prosperity. The correlation felt causal. Stop worshipping the Queen of Heaven and the food runs out. Jeremiah's response is devastating. The disaster did not come because you worshipped the Queen of Heaven. It came because Yahweh could no longer bear the abominations you were committing. Jeremiah 44 verse 22. The prosperity was his provision despite their idolatry, not because of it. The Egyptian gods received their most comprehensive defeat not in a single confrontation, but in a systematic 10-act drama that most people have read without fully understanding its theological significance. The 10 plagues of Egypt are not random acts of divine violence. Each plague is a targeted theological statement, a specific attack on a specific Egyptian deity, a demonstration that the god of slaves is sovereign over every power that Egypt worships. The Nile turned to blood. The Nile was sacred to the Egyptians, associated with the god Hapi, the god of the annual flood that made Egyptian agriculture possible. The Nile was the source of Egyptian life. Yahweh turns it to blood. The source of life becomes the source of death, the plague of frogs. Frogs were associated with the Egyptian goddess Heket, a frog-headed deity of fertility and childbirth. The symbol of the goddess becomes a plague. What Egypt worshipped as a sign of fertility fills their houses and their beds and their ovens. The plague of darkness, the most theologically significant plague before the final one. 3 days of complete darkness in Egypt while the Israelites have light in their dwellings. Exodus 10 verse 23. Ra, the sun god, was the supreme deity of the Egyptian pantheon. The pharaoh himself was considered the son of Ra. His power was the power of the sun, and for 3 days the sun does not exist in Egypt. Ra is silent. Ra is absent. The supreme god of Egypt is publicly humiliated in his own territory, and the final plague, the death of the firstborn, including the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne and the firstborn of the captive who is in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock, Exodus 12 verse 29. Pharaoh was not just the political ruler of Egypt, he was considered divine, a god in human form, the son of Ra, the living incarnation of Horus, the most powerful being in the world, and his firstborn son, the heir to the divine throne, dies in the night. Here is what most people never realize about the 10 plagues as a theological statement. Exodus 12 verse 12. On all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. On all the gods of Egypt, not on the Egyptian people alone, on the gods. The plagues are not just punishment of a nation. They are the judgment of the supernatural powers behind Egypt's religion, the dismantling of an entire theological system, the public catastrophic demonstration that the god of a nation of slaves is more powerful than every deity in the most powerful empire in the world. Egypt does not recover from the Exodus. Not in the biblical narrative, not as a theological power. The nation that enslaved the people of Yahweh and whose gods were publicly humiliated by the one true God never again poses a serious theological threat to Israel in the biblical text. Beelzebul, the lord of the flies, is the Philistine god of Ekron, and he reappears in the New Testament in a form that connects the ancient Canaanite false god directly to the spiritual opposition to Jesus. 2 Kings 1, King Ahaziah of Israel falls through the lattice in his upper chamber in Samaria and is injured. He sends messengers to inquire of Beelzebul, the god of Ekron, whether he will recover from his injury, not to Yahweh, to the Philistine fly god. The king of Israel, the covenant people of Yahweh, sends his messengers to ask a Philistine deity about his medical prognosis. Elijah intercepts the messengers with a message from Yahweh. Is it because there is no God in Israel that you are going to inquire of Beelzebul, the god of Ekron? Therefore thus says the Lord, You shall not come down from the bed to which you have gone up, but you shall surely die. Is it because there is no God in Israel? The indictment is precise. The king of Israel, the son of the covenant, consulting a foreign deity because he has forgotten or rejected the God whose name is on his own nation. And in Matthew 12 verse 24, the Pharisees accuse Jesus of casting out demons by Beelzebul, the prince of demons. Beelzebul is the Greek form of Beelzebub. The ancient Philistine fly god of Ekron has become, in the New Testament period, the name used for the prince of demons. The spiritual power behind the false god of Ekron is now understood as one of the highest-ranking demonic powers in the hierarchy of spiritual opposition to God. Here is what most people never realize about the Beelzebul accusation in Matthew 12. It is the accusation that produces Jesus' statement about the unforgivable sin. The Pharisees attribute the work of the Holy Spirit to the prince of demons. They take the power of Yahweh operating through Jesus and assign it to the most prominent demonic power in their spiritual vocabulary. The false god of the Philistines, the fly god of Ekron, the demon behind the idol, is the name they reach for when they want to deny the work of God. Beelzebub appears in 2 Kings as the god that an Israelite king chooses over Yahweh. He appears in Matthew 12 as the name the religious leaders of Israel used to deny the work of the Holy Spirit in Jesus, from the false god of a neighboring nation to the name used to blaspheme the Son of God. The spiritual entity behind the idol has not changed, only the context has. Tammuz is one of the most obscure false gods in the Bible. He appears only once, Ezekiel 8 verse 14. And he brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. Women weeping for Tammuz, in the north gate of the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem. This is one of 8 abominations that Ezekiel is shown in the temple complex. The presence of God departing from a temple defiled by the worship of foreign gods. Tammuz was a Mesopotamian deity, a dying and rising god associated with vegetation and the cycles of agricultural life. The myth of Tammuz described his annual death in the summer drought and his resurrection in the spring rains. His worshippers, primarily women, mourned his death in an annual ritual of weeping designed to hasten his resurrection and the return of agricultural fertility. Here is what most people never realize about the significance of Tammuz in Ezekiel 8. The women weeping for Tammuz are not in a pagan temple in a foreign city. They are in the temple of Yahweh in Jerusalem. The ritual mourning for a dying and rising Mesopotamian vegetation god is taking place at the entrance to the most sacred space in Israel, in the house of the God who is himself the source of all fertility, all rain, all growth, all life. The abomination is not just the worship of a false god, it is the worship of a false god in the house of the true God, the confusion of the two, the reduction of Yahweh to one deity among many who can share his house with the gods of the nations, and Ezekiel watches the glory of God depart from that house. Ezekiel 10. The presence that made the temple the most sacred space in the world leaves, because the presence of God and the worship of Tammuz in the same building is not possible, not because God is weak, because the holiness of God and the abomination of idol worship in his house cannot coexist. The New Testament introduces a different kind of false god, not the national deities of the surrounding nations, the gods of the Roman Empire. Acts 17. Paul in Athens, the most intellectually sophisticated city in the ancient world, surrounded by idols. Acts 17, verse 16. Now while Paul was waiting for them at Athens, his spirit was provoked within him, as he saw that the city was full of idols, full of idols. Athens in the 1st century was a city of temples and statues and altars to every deity in the Greco-Roman pantheon. Zeus, the king of the gods, Athena, the goddess of wisdom, whose massive statue stood inside the Parthenon, Poseidon, the god of the sea, Apollo, the god of the sun and prophecy, Hermes, the messenger god, Ares, the god of war, Aphrodite, the goddess of love, Dionysus, the god of wine, and the altar to the unknown god, Acts 17, verse 23, to the unknown god. The altar to the unknown god is one of the most theologically significant details in the entire book of Acts. The Athenians, in their comprehensive religiosity, had erected an altar to a god they did not know, to cover whatever deity they might have missed in their extensive pantheon, just in case. And Paul stands before the Areopagus, the intellectual council of Athens, and says, "What you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you. The God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything." Acts 17 verses 24 and 25. He does not live in temples made by man. The God Paul is introducing to Athens is not one deity among the many whose temples fill the city. He is the one who made the world in which the temples were built. He is not served by human hands as though he needed anything. The entire transactional model of ancient religion, you give the god something, and the god gives you something in return, is dismantled in a single sentence. This God does not need anything from you. He is the one from whom you receive everything. Here is what most people never realize about Paul's speech in Athens. He does not begin by condemning the Athenians for idolatry. He begins by acknowledging their religious seriousness. Acts 17 verse 22. I perceive that in every way you are very religious. He finds a point of contact, the altar to the unknown God, and uses it as the bridge to introduce the one who is not unknown. The approach is not confrontation, but revelation. Not, your gods are demons and you are wicked. I see that you are searching for something you have not found, and here is what you have been searching for. The unknown God is known. His name is the God who raised Jesus from the dead. Acts 17 verse 31. Revelation brings the false gods of the Bible to their final accounting. Revelation 12 describes a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, the ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world, the being who has been behind every false god from the garden to the Roman Empire, the spiritual power that offered the kingdoms of the world to Jesus in the temptation of Matthew 4 verse 9, all these I will give you if you will fall down and worship me, because they were his to offer. The one who had received the worship of the nations through the false gods who bore 1,000 different names across 1,000 different cultures across the entire history of the world. And Revelation 12 verse 9. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. Thrown down, the Greek eblethi, thrown, cast, hurled. The same verb used in Matthew 8 verse 16 for casting out demons. The one who stood behind Baal and Asherah and Molech and Dagon and Chemosh and Ashtoreth and Tammuz and Zeus and every other false god in the history of the world is thrown down. And Revelation 20 verses 1 through 3. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, that ancient serpent who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years, and threw him into the pit and shut it and sealed it over him. Bound, sealed, for 1,000 years. And after the 1,000 years, Revelation 20 verse 10. The devil who had deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulphur, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever, day and night forever and ever. The being who accepted the worship of the nations through 1,000 false gods, who led the nations into idolatry and child sacrifice and sexual immorality and violence in the name of gods that were no gods, who stood behind Baal on Mount Carmel and Dagon in the temple of Ashdod and Beelzebul, in the accusation of the Pharisees. That being is in the lake of fire, forever. The defeat that began with the first plague on Egypt, that continued through Elijah on Mount Carmel, that advanced through Paul in Athens, that was accomplished decisively at the cross, is completed finally in Revelation 20. Every false god, every demonic power behind every idol, every spiritual being that accepted the worship that belonged to God alone, defeated, bound, cast into the lake of fire, and Revelation 21 verse 3. Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God. The nations that were assigned to spiritual beings in Deuteronomy 32 and led into idolatry by those beings are now the people of God. The nations that worshipped Baal and Asherah and Molech and Dagon and Chemosh and the Queen of Heaven and Zeus and the unknown god of Athens are now the people among whom the true God dwells. The false gods are gone, the demons are bound, the idol temples are rubble, and the Creator of all things has come to live permanently with the creatures he made in his image. Every false god, defeated, one by one. Here is where every thread converges. The false gods of the Bible are not a catalogue of ancient superstitions that embarrass modern readers. They are the record of a war that began when spiritual beings were assigned to the nations and chose to accept worship instead of pointing the nations toward the Most High. A war that escalated when Israel entered Canaan and found a world saturated with the worship of beings who had corrupted the nations they were meant to shepherd. A war that reached its decisive moment at the cross, where the one who stood behind every false god was publicly defeated. And a war that ends in Revelation when every spiritual power that refused to bow to the Creator is bound and cast into the lake of fire forever. The God who appeared to Moses in the burning bush was not one deity among many competing for market share in the ancient religious marketplace. He was the creator of the nations that were worshipping the false gods, the sovereign over the spiritual beings who had become the false gods, the one to whom every knee would eventually bow, whether in worship or in defeat. And the defeat of every false god is not primarily a story about the weakness of the gods. It is primarily a story about the power of the one who defeats them. The God who turns the Nile to blood and falls fire from heaven and dismembers Dagon in his own temple and throws the dragon into the lake of fire is the same God who breathed into Adam's nostrils in Genesis 2 and who will dwell with his people permanently in the new creation of Revelation 21. He was never threatened by the false gods. He was always going to defeat them. The only question was whether the people who bore his name would stay loyal to him long enough to see the victory. Some did, many did not. But the victory came regardless. It always does. If this study meant something to you, if the false gods of the Bible make more sense now as spiritual powers than as primitive superstitions, the single most helpful thing you can do is subscribe. Every video on this channel goes this carefully into the language, the history, the archaeology, and the meaning behind what the Bible actually says. Leave a comment. It can be just one word. Even a single word in the comments helps other people find this conversation. And there are people out there who have read about Baal and Dagon and Molech their entire lives without understanding the spiritual warfare framework that makes sense of every one of them. Share it with someone who thinks the Old Testament is just ancient history. Share it with someone who has never connected the false gods of Canaan to the spiritual powers Paul describes in Ephesians 6. Share it with someone who needs to know that the war that began in the garden ended at the cross and will be finally completed when the last enemy is cast into the lake of fire. God bless you, and please keep us in your prayers.